2. Okay, GM. Hello, everybody. Glad to have everyone trickling in. Good morning. Hey, William, Alfreda, Will. Good to see everybody. We're really excited to get going today. I'm gonna try to keep the introduction section of Fireside brief so that we can get into conversation with Eva, Beylin, Andy, and Alicia, which will kick off in about 10 minutes if I do my job right. And it starts with talking about module 3 of block 4. So first and foremost, welcome to Eva. We'll do a couple of slides to just set the stage for Kernel block 4. This is a bit about the Kernel fellows that are with us today. We'll be in the Fireside in chat will be hopefully pretty active, and we'll try to make it possible at the end for people to unmute and so you can meet some of these people one-on-one or in Q&A sections. But great people of all shapes and sizes, of all types of professional backgrounds, and all types of personal pursuits. And in Kernel, the personal pursuits portion is perhaps more interesting, and we're really excited to be joined by such a great group, and we're really excited for this Fireside. So I'll keep going into the kind of like where we are in Kernel section. We are now officially at the halfway point of Kernel, which means that there's been a couple of build weeks. Many people have been going through the process of developing on their Kernel adventures, whether that be prototypes that they already had prior to coming into Kernel or new projects altogether. It's typically a part of the program where you have you had the first 2 weeks where people have met each other, and it's been higher energy and lots of serendipitous conversations towards a period of more introspection. And I hope for the Kernel Fellows, you've been feeling a little bit more space in week 3. I would expect that to continue into weeks 4 and 5, where we do have Expo Week, which is obviously kind of like a big external event. But after that, weeks 5 and 6 continue to be quieter before we end with a bang with week 7. So keep enjoying that. Please do sign up for Expo Week if you haven't yet. We'll be closing signups tomorrow, which will be the last day that you can sign up. The first session is Tuesday. We have another one Wednesday, and then the last one is on Friday. And in efforts to make use of that quiet time, we did introduce Kernel pods today, which for anyone who is still feeling like they're in a mode where they want to meet other people in Kernel, the way that pods were set up, Alicia did an incredible job, and everyone on the stewards team kind of took a look and thought about the conversations that we'd had with all of the different Kernel fellows we've met, and tried to group into both geographically and interest-based groups of about 10 Kernel fellows. So you should have gotten a message in your Slack DMs with your Kernel pod, which introduces you quietly to that group of 10. There's no Slack channel to hang out with the pod. There's no expectation on what you do with that group. Simply put, that group of 10 people is people that we think you would enjoy getting to know. So if the time and the space comes up now, that's perfect. If it comes up in the future, that's also perfect. Just treat it as a suggestion to connection when the time is right. So those are the 2 big announcements. We'll go to a Gather Town space today that has some specific tables. If you want to say hello or see if anyone in the pod is with us today for Fireside, you can meet them there if you haven't already. So those are the 2 big announcements. This brings us to the fun part. So I'll pass the mic to Andy to talk us a bit through module 3, and then we'll kick off into conversation.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back and to be enjoying a slightly more serene pace to things. I hope everybody is feeling a little bit of that space. This week's module is primarily around freedom and intention because it relates so deeply to what it means to take back the web. You will see, particularly in the crafted reading today and throughout this week, that there is an extended argument for applying this notion of complementary opposites and quantum thoughts, the interplay of two sides of the spectrum and the ability to hold not just those in mind, but the entire spectrum between, and choose with humility your own trade-off as it applies to these two most critical aspects of the work that we do in Web3 and indeed the way that we live more generally. Right? Freedom and intention go to the very heart of human being. You'll find that intention is not a new concept. It's deeply encoded into the legal system. It's deeply encoded into the ways in which we have related forever. And yet it's not that prominent in modern culture because we have this notion that what we do matters more than what we mean. And a lot of this week's intention is to try and overturn that quite toxic and parasitic idea. Right? That in fact it is by being clear about one's intention that you can understand which of the infinite possible actions in any moment is likely to most closely bring your internal and external world into some kind of harmony or coherence. And you will find in every major wisdom tradition around the world, there is this deep focus on the ability to groom or otherwise refine our intention, because intention is deeply linked to awareness. Awareness is deeply linked to freedom. And it's not really the political concept that is talked about this week, although it has implications for it. It is the freedom to choose how we respond by being conscious of the constraints under which we operate. It's based on the Buddhist idea of the freedom of no escape, that when we truly accept who we are as we are, there is a freedom beyond words in that. But the somewhat superficial notion of being able to do as you please is no freedom at all. How we understand that idea in application is by looking at these three critical pillars that have been outlined this week, which is that taking back the web really means augmenting our ability to think for ourselves. It means reclaiming our time, and it means extending our ability to cooperate. Each one of these relates to one of the curated readings in this week's material. Augmenting our ability to think for ourselves happens through transformative tools for thought, new kinds of media that are public goods in the sense that language is a public good. And you'll remember that last week we spoke about this notion that there are these new econo-linguistic networks, which are developments of the order of language. They're not a new kind of language. They're a development of the order of language, if we look at the sort of arc of human developments and consciousness. And in that sense, this is the kind of public good that this week is concerned about. Because if we are able to develop these kinds of tools, we can have more time to spend together, have more time to investigate the nature of human being, right? Like Douglas Rushkoff makes this really beautiful point that the nature of the distraction changes constantly, but the opportunity and the challenge is forever the same, which is to be present. And when we're truly present, what is that really about? Well, it's about being co-conspirators, right? So it takes us all the way back to maybe in week 0, this notion of joyful subversion, because the actual word conspirator, it means to breathe with. This is what technology should do, right? Give us more time to breathe with one another, because that is the shared essence which lies at the heart of humility, right? We can talk a little bit about extending our ability to cooperate with Eva, but breath is the thing that all of us do. And it is the thing which links us all together. We breathe common air, right? And breath is also like such an important part of any intentional approach to the world, because it is that action which you can do both consciously and which happens without your awareness. And as such links like what is known and unknown in many different wisdom traditions, and leads to this notion of humility, right? That humility comes from the Latin humus, means earth, that which we share. To be humble is to see every single other person as no different from yourself. And we see every single other person as no different from ourselves because we recognize that we have this shared ground which gives us nourishment. In particular, humus in gardening terms is that layer of soil into which trees, flowers, and other living organic matter decays, and from which new life is birthed. And it's in understanding these cycles that we go through together and that are fundamentally shared, that we can begin to speak about transcending our current paradigm. Because transcendence comes through an understanding of our foundation and root. So we have a somewhat circular but deeply intentional approach to the work this week. And hopefully that brings us more and more into this recognition of what freedom in the internal sense really is about. What kinds of customs and practices, which is what we'll be speaking about next week, can lead us to uncover the freedom that we already are. So that's most of the modules for this week. Vivek, I don't know if you would like to introduce Eva before I begin to pepper her with questions.
I would. Yes, thank you, Andy. And I think the way that I'm excited for this conversation because Eva has, for me, always been a source of inspiration in clarity of thinking around what it means to have a open, transparent, public ledger with data that is offshooting in a variety of different ways, and what that means and how we can consult that in interesting ways. She also happens to be the top meme lord on the internet as of the last 24 hours. And that alongside her background, as the director of the Graph and her work at eGirl, and the fact that she got through being the sister of Eva Beylin for 20 years of life. There's a lot of things about Eva that we're really grateful for. And I think that, since I've met her, I've been increasingly impressed with the ways that she's moved through Web3 and the way that the Graph has grown since she took over and started in that role as the director of the Graph Foundation has been just kind of like magical to watch in many ways. So really grateful to have her, excited to kick off this conversation.
Yeah, that last point, I mean, despite the weight and imports of everything else, surviving sisterhood with Eva Beylin is truly incredible, incredible achievement. Well done. So Eva, in the announcement post for the Graph Foundation, in which Janov spoke about you and why you were selected as the first director, one of the things which he so beautifully said was that Eva is one of the true believers. And I wonder if you can speak about what you understand that term to mean, particularly as it relates to what you see as the big picture and the long-term view of Web3 and in particular open data.
Yeah, first of all, thank you all for having me here. It's really exciting to see this many people interested in Web3. To answer this question, I think it might be best to go back to how I got into Web3 or crypto. So my brother actually, who's on the call, Mark Beylin, was working at Consensus building a bounties network. So essentially a way for people to distribute work in a freelance way. on Ethereum. And so at the time I was working in management consulting. Most of my clients were banks, payment companies, and I realized very quickly it didn't make sense why I would work on building out legacy infrastructure or improving legacy infrastructure when we have Ethereum right here, which solves a lot of the problems. And so I spent several months before I quit sort of learning from Mark and others on what it is that crypto enables. And I became a believer simply because it made sense to live in an open and decentralized universe, with the tech actually also being decentralized rather than in a very centralized authoritarian fashion as happens today. So getting to see that literally from the inside of some of the top banks and payment companies and the way they behave and what they value and how little they value their users was really clear to me. Ethereum was the place to be. And then I joined Omise Go, which was a payment company. And my belief there was, I loved the payments use case. There was something about enabling payments globally, equal access to banking. We kind of came up with the slogan, unbank the bank, unbank the banked. And to me, the belief here was, we don't actually need anyone to give us permission. And this, societal belief that institutions or technology providers are giving us permission is simply because of a limitation of the technology. And now we have a technology that obviously, is not intended to be illegal or evade taxes in any way, but provides us much more flexibility to make our own rules. So in cases where, Twitter takes down an account or AWS takes down a website, these kinds of things should never happen. It should be up to the right of the user and maybe at least one node provider that might be willing to provide that service to keep a website up. And really that's the vision, is, decentralized empowerment.
Incredible. Yeah, I really love that. It's ironic because today there's a huge story breaking in South Africa, which has been going on in Europe for some time, about the world's largest tax fraud, with all of the big banks being involved in what's called CumEx trading, which is to do with dividends withholding tax, and is a result of the fact that settlements on these major exchanges is still T+2. And so you can get away with kind of buying the dividend shares before the dividend is issued and selling them immediately afterwards and getting tax reimbursements, which is just not possible on Ethereum because it's T0, right? So that kind of stuff is really interesting, and the permissionless nature of things is really wonderful. I thought that we could dig a little bit deeper into that, because one of the things that Vivek had on the introduction slide for you comes from an article that you wrote recently, where you said that I view DAOs as the solution for efficient coordination of free market behaviors to optimize public interests. So in another podcast that you did recently, you spoke of like the sufficient coordination as being about no more redundant APIs and decentralizing every component of the stack. Are there other kinds of means of these efficient kinds of coordination, or would you unpack those two a little bit for us?
Yeah, so in terms of the first one, I was watching a lot of Milton Friedman videos just on his take. If anyone, wants to do that in their spare time, the economists are interesting. And realizing, his perspective was the free market always wins. And, the free market is a better coordinator. And really taking that in the lens of crypto, a DAO combines a free market with otherwise a government type of organization, because the goals are quite similar. Most of the DAOs we have are to fund public goods, to fund in the best interest of that protocol or that community. But the actual organization of a DAO is very different. So one way I like to think about this is, in a private company, the only people that actually care about what you're doing or building are the people who work at that company, or maybe the public shareholders if you're large enough. Whereas in a protocol or in Web3, anyone can care about anything. All it really takes is for you to perhaps buy a token or join the community in some other on-chain fashion. And that means that we can have so many different people or companies, entities, stakeholders with different interests participating. So I think it solves the problem of, with government, we try to convince ourselves that people aren't corrupt or they won't have self-interest, when that's just not true. And so a DAO provides us that avenue that someone can be self-interested, they can have their own sort of company, but also participate in public goods coordination.
It's really interesting, this notion of anyone can care. It kind of plugs into a narrative which is fairly prevalent, especially at the moment, but kind of as the result of the work of David Grieber, who's a great inspiration for us. So that was like, what does an infrastructure of care look like, and how do DAOs plug into that in ways which perhaps traditional institutions can't?
Totally. What was the second point I forgot that you asked about Web3?
The Web3, well, we'll come to it because I want to ask you a little bit more about efficient coordination and public interest. But public interest and care are linked together. You know, like, what is the public really interested in, and how do we build the infrastructure which will enable more and more people to care in many different ways? Yeah,
what we're realizing, at least at the Graph, is we very quickly became a many org protocol in a fashion that was off-chain first. So our process of decentralizing was more progressive. We started with a smaller decentralized council for our governance of the protocol. So that's 10 stakeholders. And we started with a foundation that is overseen by that council rather than going to a DAO first. But what that's allowed us to do is find several companies or groups of people that now are dedicating themselves full-time to the Graph. And that is exact evidence of entities that might otherwise be private or have their own goals are willing to harmonize under the goal of the Graph, and bring it to fruition. Whereas maybe that wouldn't have been possible if we were on Web 2 or dealing with Web 2 type of incentives.
It's such a fascinating notion for me because I mean, we've been speaking quite a lot with Kia and some other people from deep down in the DAO world about the different ways of organizing and how amorphous this term is. Every single one of the letters, I mean, Kia's thing at the moment is really about autonomous, both in the sense of automation, which was like first kind of imagined, but also in like the political sense in some of the work of Audrey Lang, and that it's really wonderful. But what I'm fascinated by in your work is this notion that there are many different parties with conflicting interests able to harmonize around a particular mission. And that, to me, seems like the real seed of something different as an organizational pattern from anything that we've seen before. If you join a company, you kind of have to buy in to the mission, and not just that, but the source of your sustenance in terms of finance and in terms of shares, in terms of equity, all of these kinds of things. And yet now all of a sudden you can have like a radically different perspectives all pursuing the same kind of protocol mission. And the best example of this is Bitcoin or Ethereum itself. These are the first DAOs, and yet people using them do so for like often completely orthogonal reasons. So I wonder, can you unpack a little bit this notion of like conflicting interests, multiple actors, and harmonizing around a mission? How has that worked in the Graph, and how do you think about it more generally?
Yeah, I can start with the Graph as a good example. So for those unfamiliar with the Graph, we are a Web3 protocol for indexing data. So any way that a developer wants to query data from a blockchain, maybe to run their application like Uniswap, or for data analysis, you can use the Graph. And so we built it in a decentralized manner with 4 stakeholders. So there's indexers, those are the node operators. There's curators, who are often the actual subgraph developers, delegators, and then we also have the actual end users. And because we have 4 very, very distinct users, we're seeing it firsthand how those interests clash. So whereas in maybe other protocols like a Uniswap or Aave, perhaps the voters of that DeFi DAO are quite closely tied to maybe the liquidity providers or whatever other liquidity incentives might occur on that protocol. Within the Graph, we have essentially hardware DevOps engineers arguing with investors who are delegators, about critical protocol improvements. And that's, never really happened. That's kind of cool. So what we're seeing is, very quickly you have to coordinate the human element. Like DAOs don't solve everything. And, we aren't even quite at the official DAO form yet, but realizing that humans are really the issue. It's, tooling can make it easier, taking calls, whatever, all those operational things make it easier. But, if there's no trust, if there's no even desire to communicate, we have a forum that now is quite rich for that kind of communication. It makes it very hard for you to actually harmonize. At the end of the day, an indexer's revenue or business model, is very different than that of a delegator or curator. But what everyone, all agrees upon is maybe the value of the Graph, and the Graph providing the most value to its projects. And so we can kind of come to terms eventually, or negotiate essentially, what might be the best trade-off for this one, improvement proposal versus another. So one example we saw in the wild was, delegators got really angry about a specific change that was made for indexers. And it was this process of having to persuade the delegators, it was okay, we're still thinking about them, we're going to make sure that their interests are taken care of in the next GIPs. And that wasn't an on-chain, hash or commit. That was simply communicating with our community and the people to try and create that confidence. And so subsequently, those delegators are now even more involved in proposal making, which just kind of shows that if you can create that space for different interests, those people might actually become more involved in your community.
It's really amazing. I love that example for two reasons. The first is that it reminds me of a Derrida essay, who I'm a massive fan of. It's called Signature Event Context, and it begins with this wonderful question: can we communicate the term communication? It's really wonderful, but it's sort of, I love the structure of that essay because it's also talking about, like, there's the on-chain stuff, the signature, the actual commitments in a public and verifiable environments that's adversarial and all of these other kinds of things. Then there's the event that goes on around that, the vote. And then there's this context, which is what we all kind of turn our back on because we want to do this autonomous, completely verifiable and predictable thing. But like, context is where all of the human stuff lives. And I wonder, like, there's something really interesting to be explored in terms of that notion of trust. It's a big part of the Kernel syllabus. And I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about how the council was formed, the focus on diversity, and how you actually achieved that, not as some sort of emergent happy results, but like the deep focus on that, and how those two things play into trust.
Yeah, so originally when we launched the Graph protocol, we really wanted to prioritize diverse perspectives because we have so many different stakeholders. So we have 5 different stakeholder groups on the council. That's indexers, delegators, the users, so that is the dApp developer, the original team or sort of the core developer, and then research and security. So, to me, anecdotally, it reminds me a bit of Lebanon, where even in Lebanon's government, they have equal representation of different religions. And so kind of taking that approach of enabling the diverse perspectives, the different interests to have a voice. So those were hand selected. And upon launching the protocol, they were, admitted as the council. What that has allowed us to do is, have a lot more rich, conversations where sometimes the perspectives being brought to the table you otherwise would never have, right? So if you're making maybe a technical roadmap decision, you now have maybe investors or end users that are able to have a say in that, strategy definition. The trade-off of that is it takes a while to build trust. So to your point, we've had some council discussions where we're passing a really large grant, maybe one of our core developer grants. And, there's one member who has great concern because it's not their area of expertise. And so it's actually on the other members of the council essentially to provide more information to kind of backfill whatever information gap might be there. On one hand, that makes things a little less efficient. So even we're learning, perhaps there needs to be subgroups or sub-DAOs. That's a trend we're seeing anyways with other protocols like Orca, where they're optimizing for this idea of sub-communities rather than one large community or one large DAO. So there's definitely trade-offs. I think the benefit to us has been because the graph is so multidisciplinary, it doesn't make sense or wouldn't do justice to our community if we didn't have all these perspectives.
One of the great privileges for me of being involved with Kernel was that in the Genesis block, we were lucky enough to have some representatives of the Longhouse Council Council up in Canada join us, and they invited a few of us to observe their council meetings. And what is really interesting about those council meetings is that consensus is a means, not an end. And it is a highly structured space in many ways, although there's this room for the flow of interesting and serendipitous conversation and dialogue to arise, real exploration together. And like, what's so interesting for me is that they do have these subgroups that you just sort of mentioned, but held in a wider narrative structure. So there are 3 major tribes involved in the Longhouse: the bear, the wolf, and the turtle clan. And each representative of those clans plays a very specific role in council meetings. They're expected to perform different functions, and you're not, you can play within that role, but you're not really allowed to step out of the role. The turtle clan is the person who leads the council and holds it all together, because the turtle has knowledge of the external laws, but also the internal laws. The wolf is the messenger of all things, because he's what's exploring the environment around him, and the bear is responsible for transition, basically, and medicinal healing and all sorts of really interesting things within the wider narrative. So I wonder, like, how do you think about narrative, and do you think about, like, not personalities in the council, but roles, and like sort of fulfilling those as a way of building out these subgroups?
Yeah, we definitely are thinking about roles more organically. So I think what's cool about the graph is, because we've been very upfront about our sort of progressively decentralized approach, it's allowed us to learn from our process organically and how we want to build the DAO. So what's becoming clear, is exactly what you're saying, that we actually do need roles. Aside from the foundation, there's myself, we also have sort of a governance PM, and we, to your point, oversee, or kind of are, aware of the internal and external rules. But even within the council, we're recognizing that we need leads. So each, funding proposal, or every treasury decision comes down to it being a project or a proposal. And there's typically, someone who's the sponsor, or the one that's leading the due diligence, or the one doing the interview process. And all of these things kind of get lost in the DAO conversation. Like, a DAO is not simply submitting a proposal on chain. A DAO that's successful and reflects the community is one that's had hours of due diligence, likely many interviews, someone who's willing to put their reputation on the line. And so we're realizing in the council that, there are these sort of unofficial leads now, within their domain expertise, but actually we need to grow it more. And we're realizing just, why you need either, a larger DAO or many sub DAOs, because in the current confines of our 10-person governance, it's just simply not enough. There's too many roles, there's too many things that we need done. And we probably need other experts. So we started thinking about what we call domain experts, which are people we tap, for maybe large grants or other decisions that we can kind of do due diligence with, maybe even give them a grant depending on the work, and then filter up that information to the council. And so hopefully long-term, this becomes sort of the bones for a larger community DAO.
Incredible. I love that. Yeah, there's a sense of, having sort of matryoshka dolls all the way down. Just these, we sent the two Beylin siblings out into the world, and it's just Russian DAOs all the way down. Should be perfect. It kind of brings me to another point, because in one of these announcement pieces from the graph about the foundation and the council and your work, it reads, "The graph is arriving as a global data layer that provides an organizing and unifying force for the decentralization movement." And that's such an interesting idea for me, because you have at once this notion of organization and unity, and yet contrasted with decentralization. And so often the way that we speak about decentralization, the kinds of stories that we tell about it, and the implications of our narratives are this like process of diffusion, and so I wonder, like, what is the interplay between the diffusion of power and the unity of vision? How does that play out in your world?
That's such a beautiful question, Andy. I feel like only you'd come up with that. I think that they can almost work together. The way I like to think about the internet, right? Like, one could think of the current internet as a monopoly, in the sense that there is only one. However, it's actually quite decentralized. And so, in the idea of unifying around a goal, it doesn't mean that everyone who's unifying around that goal needs to be a centralized party or even have the same incentives. But there is a decision almost to combine resources into one objective, rather than fragmenting them around many. So yes, we could decentralize its turtles all the way down, but is that necessary? Is it necessary? Is it necessarily the most ideal solution? And so in the graph's case, the problem that's being solved is very, very challenging. So, querying data off a blockchain is challenging for a developer in a centralized manner. The status quo would be a developer building a server or database, probably, creating their own wrapper and their own indexer, and then having to maintain it, which means maybe they're building their own APIs, they're writing proprietary code, probably redundant code, because, many people are building on the same smart contracts like Uniswap. How many Uniswap dApps exist? And then, okay, what about the cost, of the developers maintaining that infrastructure, the cost of their own labor, et cetera. And so this is an example where, if we actually build a network and the decentralization, is at the participant level, not in the number of networks, then maybe we can actually create more, positive sum impacts. In the case of the graph, the thing that really stuck with me, why I committed the last few years to it is, we can't call things dApps unless every component of the stack is decentralized. It's just LARPing. And if, that starts with storage, starts with indexing, every aspect has to be decentralized. Otherwise, the government, whoever, a villain, anyone, could then attack that central point of failure. And so for the graphs case, that means we need indexers, we need curators, we need at least one individual who's willing to provide the service. Because the point of the graph is, apps should not be able to be taken down. They should be decentralized, and that there should be at least one person in the network that's willing to serve that app at a cost. So, to bring this into layman's terms, what was that app, Parler, that was taken down? So in the case of Parler, instead of AWS or a centralized company deciding that Parler should go down, maybe if they were on the graph network, there would likely be a lot of indexers that chose not to. But maybe there's some indexers, who would love to serve those queries, and they love the controversy. And maybe they even raise the price of those queries because they recognize it's, a premium service they're providing. And really what we believe is, that is exactly the way it should be. It should be a free market decision. If someone wants to provide that service, then they should be able to. There shouldn't be a central, arbiter essentially deciding, what happens in our universe.
It's a profound point that is often underappreciated. And it's always been one of the things which I resonate most with, with you and various of the different projects and people that you've been involved with over the years. It's almost an opportunity for me to bring up one dishonorable mention. I want to do that later because what I really want to sort of hone in and focus on is this really stunning point, I think, that you made, that like unity of vision is not about agreement, it's about participation, right? It's about like everybody participating in the network despite their conflicting opinions, values, ways of being in the world. And it kind of brings up this tweet that you put out a while back, which really appeals to me, where you said, what if instead of hating the Sybil attack, we embraced it, welcomed the multi-character user, and raised our standard for participation in on-chain communities, so Sybil attackers would have to develop many actively contributing personas. It's amazing, turn the hackers into these incredible sort of actively contributing personas is really interesting. And I wonder, like, what kind of customs you have in mind when you speak about like actively contributing personas, and how that looks in the graph, but also again, like more broadly as well, like what does it mean to contribute for you?
Yeah, so I guess some background on why I was thinking about that. For those who don't know, I also invest with eGirl Capital, which is mostly pseudonons. So there's only myself and 2 others who've doxed. And the idea of identity has been really on my mind, in that, do you have to be tied to your Web2 KYC identity for you to have an identity? And, in crypto research, we often think about the Sybil attack, which means to essentially copy your identity, or, have many, as an attack against mechanism design. And so a lot of the, theoretical or idealistic systems that we want to create, the blocker right now is this inability for us to have Sybil resistance, this inability to identify if someone is really just them or if their identity is being copied. Now, what I've realized is, like, first of all, that's not solvable. We've now, for 5 years in the Ethereum community, it hasn't quite been solved in a way that's decentralized. But furthermore, why are we trying to solve it? Because the idea of pseudonymity is quite fascinating for ourselves. Like, never before have we been able to compartmentalize our identities or our interests in a way that we can create different brands. So only really celebrities are afforded this luxury of having their birth name and then their stage name and then maybe some other name, and they create these personas and businesses around them. And why can't we as people do the same? And so taking it further, how do we remove the attack vector that is the Sybil attack, well, we could just raise the standard for identity where, simply creating a new wallet address should not be enough for you to then be able to attack or participate in a system, but perhaps some other past participation in that community is the benchmark or threshold for you to then participate. So that's something we've been thinking a lot about at the Graph, in designing our DAO, and even how can we use a subgraph as that vehicle, where a subgraph itself is an API, you can aggregate data in it. So, anything as simple as total trade volume, but anything more complex as, what is Andy's reputation in the Gitcoin community based on the on-chain behavior he's had? And maybe he earned some kind of reputation or has some kind of score based on, his past contributions. And maybe that kind of threshold is the baseline needed for Andy or anyone basically to participate in the future Gitcoin DAOs. And so in that sense, we actually eliminate the problems of Sybil attacking because we've raised our own standards for what it means to be a contributor.
I wonder, Eva, in terms of raising the standards using, like a subgraph, and this idea that decentralization includes like many people, and that's some of the benefits. So if we say ran something where we put that in place with Gitcoin, and then the number of participants like is severely diminished, is that kind of, do you think that is just part of the process and it's just because we're literally at the beginning of this journey, and then as time progresses that will change? Or is that kind of the intention and the trade-off, that it just means that the participation level drops, but in terms of like the truly valuable engagement, that might kind of go through the roof?
Yeah, I think it's kind of both. Voter apathy is true. Even in early examples as Moloch DAO, where we only had about 30 members, we were experiencing a lot of voter apathy. So we should be expecting that at the DAO level. And so, right now, maybe us including those Sybil attackers, is kind of us LARPing at the size of our DAOs. And to your point, creating maybe a more reputation-driven or maybe contribution-driven system would, start off with fewer participants, but then it would encourage those that actually do want to contribute to either increase their quality of contributions, or you'd only filter out for those who actually want to participate. And really, at the end of the day, you don't want people in your community who are just there for fun or LARPing. You want people who are contributing, adding value in whatever way that is. Doesn't have to be monetary. There is also, the regulatory perspective, which is as financial regulators, the US government start to put more pressure, it's even more imperative for us to have actual valuable contributors in a decentralized manner. So, this isn't just a joke, why we need decentralization. It's really now becoming existential. And so you want people in your community that you can rely on, kind of that would pass the bus test, if the whole team, took a trip and, there was a bus accident, would the team or the project survive? And so you really want your protocol to survive that. And the only way to do that is to actually incentivize high quality contributions.
Yeah, I'm really with you. I sometimes think that I would really like to be in more DAOs where people contribute by having fun. But I take your point, and it's really, really well made. I think that's before we get in, and there are a lot of questions coming through. There's just one other little point that I'd like to touch on before we kind of open it up, which is that this point of open APIs, because I think that the concept goes much further than just what we're sort of used to as developers with these programmable interfaces. There's this notion, again, on your Twitter, that NFTs are the people's APIs, and a wonderful takedown of Sam Altman, where you sort of said, well, it's bad for society that people don't realize that you can fund a startup by investing in NFTs. And I wonder how you're thinking about these kinds of new primitives for expression. Like, what is the NFT as a mode of expression, particularly in this participatory, open, adversarial network in which we're all trying to figure out what does organization actually mean, and what does contribution mean, and where is community?
Totally, yeah. Just to touch on the NFTs as human APIs, the way I think about it, an NFT in our current understanding is kind of art, collectibles, is very kind of static, but really an NFT can store any kind of metadata. And we're, now developing the infrastructure to support that metadata. So Arweave, is probably the optimal storage solution now. The Graph, we're improving our ability to index metadata. And what that allows then is an NFT to not only be art, but really to be essentially a mini database for whatever it is that that artist or collector wants, and perhaps also, programmatically changing. So, a lot of people are trying to understand, how do you have generative NFTs that might change based on-chain state? I know Mariano Conti, Maker smart contract developer, is really interested in that. But what this allows then is for us to store essentially any arbitrary data that's interesting to us in an NFT. The most interesting use case that has come out recently is ENS, which, as we know, is a unique NFT. They just enabled support for adding your PFP avatar, an NFT that maybe you own, that you identify with, and attributing that to your ENS name, and really, and any other data such as your socials, and eventually perhaps, your job or any kind of status could be just a component of metadata within an NFT. And to me, this kind of flips the way we've been thinking about data and identity over the last few years, where previously a lot of our experiments were tokenizing things. So, maybe tokenizing yourself or tokenizing a component of your identity, where now we're realizing maybe all of this can be part of NFTs itself. Maybe a lot of the information we think about could be just metadata, and the way we interact with that metadata is us, sending, transferring, staking that NFT itself. So I'm excited to see a lot more crossover of these more complex metadata heavy NFTs with communities. So communities like Friends with Benefits that have already kind of implemented reputation systems with, rewarding Friends with Benefits for those that participate in their Discord and get to upvote votes. Imagine if, they could also then earn some kind of NFT, or have a programmatically changing NFT also related to their participation in that community.
I'm such a fan of these ideas. I do. There are a lot of questions in the chat, and I'd really like to get to them, Vivek, because there are some wonderful ones. So perhaps we can slide into that, and I'll, bug Eva just perpetually, basically.
I wonder if Alfreda wants to unmute and ask a question. I can see it's just related to what we just spoke about, and then we can maybe work backwards.
Yeah, sure. Eva, I appreciate everything you have spoken about, and I was wondering about your thoughts about anonymity regarding identity and access. You were talking a bit about security aspects, and what are your thoughts on identity and anonymity? And also, I would like to hear what you're thinking about ownership regarding data. Should everyone own their own data, or should it be owned together, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so on the point of anonymity, I guess I don't necessarily believe in it. I think that, the second that you start behaving in any format, you're developing a reputation. And really, to me, identity is just an aggregation of your behavior, and we've just kind of allotted a label to that behavior. So you are a worker because you have maybe logged in enough hours or worked enough. And so in that sense, we're opening the world to having many identities. Very similarly to how I said, celebrities, we don't even consider them to be just an anonymous shady character. When Deadmau5 comes out with a new name, he's just this amazing new brand, and we welcome his identity. And I think we need to be thinking about the same. And if someone is choosing to be anonymous and choosing to not build their reputation, I think that is a signal in itself. That's an individual who is choosing not to engage enough in their community to create reputation. But I don't see an issue in itself to have, not your birth name, KYC, whatever it might be, tied to your on-chain identity. Sort of on the second question, so I fully believe in, user ownership of data. In all honesty, one of the reasons I joined the Graph was because every time I thought about the, what would it take for us to own our data, or for us more simply to just benefit from our data? So, a lot of what we talk about with ads and Instagram and Facebook, it's not necessarily the existence of these ads, it's that they are targeted to us and that we are exploited, whether it's our data or, literally we don't benefit from our viewership and the amount of time we spend looking at these ads. And so, hypothetically, if you wanted to create a user incentivized ad network, what would that look like? And for me, it always came down to the query level, where there had to be a decentralized network or an incentivized network of supporting those queries and supporting that data access. And so I fundamentally believe in data ownership. I think what it's going to look like in practice is probably many people owning, or many entities owning, different aspects of that pipeline. So, in the case of the graph, indexers, curators, delegators, are benefiting directly from serving that data, but maybe you as the end user then still get to earn a fee from the protocol based on views, and maybe there's an off-chain oracle that's dictating how many views your NFT got on Instagram, and then you as a user then get to also benefit. So I greatly believe in data ownership. I think we're just going to see many people benefit from that when we actually build it out.
Yeah. Really, Alfreda, I really liked your question about communal ownership. I haven't really heard that question asked. I don't know, Eva, if like, as you think about subgraphs, that's come up, because some of our data sources are really not about us, they're about communal space. Does that come up for you?
Yeah, it's directly coming up in that, we don't want subgraphs to be owned by one team. Really, the point is for it to be an open API. Often they're built by the protocol team, but often they're not. It might be, a front-end developer that really wants to query the Uniswap protocol, and the subgraph doesn't exist, and so they decide to build it. Then becomes the question of who maintains it. And if the subgraph itself is very valuable, meaning to that project or to the ecosystem, then communal ownership is the way to go, because it essentially becomes a public good for data. And you can imagine every single protocol having a DAO oversee that subgraph. So what we're seeing in practice, for example, is the Omen subgraph. Omen is a prediction market that was built by Gnosis, and is actually maintained by the DX DAO. So DX DAO is a very large DAO, one of the first, and they actually own the subgraph. So that's a great example of already, having communal ownership and sharing that responsibility, because, potentially the person that's querying the subgraph versus the one writing the subgraph is not the same. So of course, why wouldn't you have, many stakeholders participate? So we're looking forward to seeing this trend continue. And I think it's actually in the best interest of the protocol and also Web3, because you don't want to rely on one individual maintainer. That's just another essential point of failure.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. I think we can move to Aaron's question, which might jive with this. Please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Eva. I'd like to hear your thoughts on just the topic broadly, decentralizing AI. And what is your long-term vision for the graph as it scales larger?
Yeah, I haven't actually thought that much about decentralizing AI. But I think the themes would be the same, that, AI just being another technology or protocol, we need to decentralize it in the same ways we've decentralized all other protocols. So that would be, either decentralized decision-making about the governance. Maybe it's even decentralizing the algorithm and how we curate it. So, one experiment we did at the Graph was we launched something called Everest, which was a projects registry. So essentially a LinkedIn. And we didn't want to be the arbiter of who gets to post and what information is right. So we allowed the users themselves to actually curate. And maybe the future is AI that's curated by the data sources. Maybe we as the data sources get to participate in that curation. Maybe as a share of the data that we make up of that AI formula or algorithm. Maybe that's how we dictate who gets a say. There's other ways that I think we can try and incentivize people depending on our proximity. And so maybe it's, if an algorithm is used that includes your data, then maybe you benefit, financially, maybe you have governance rights. I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I will say we're probably a little farther away from that. Even at the Graph, we've spoken with some teams that are building AI solutions on top of the Graph. So it's a bit extra protocol, but there's still quite a bit of research because the data is not clean. And even the subgraphs, in all honesty, we've got so many features that developers have been waiting for that would make, UIs much richer, the data complexity, increasing data complexity. So I think we're, a few years out, but I think it'd be very cool to see, decentralized mechanisms as part of AI.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Okay. I think we can go quickly to Sid, and Eva, just there's like at least 7 or 8 questions. So for context, we'll try to get through as many as we can. Sid, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi Eva. I'll club my question with Simon's question, which is, what are some high services that need to be decentralized as of this year, while managing the practical trade-offs of using a centralized service when building a DApp?
Is the question which services need to be decentralized?
Yeah, what's the higher priority?
Yeah, so as I said, all layers of the stack need to be decentralized. I think main priority right now is storage. Quite a few projects by default rely on IPFS, and usually the instantiation of that is them running their own IPFS node, which is essentially just them running a centralized service, which to the user means that there's NFTs that people are spending thousands of dollars on that are, might not exist or don't necessarily exist in a network. They just exist on that one team server. So I think that's most important. I'm a big supporter of Arweave, and seeing any kind of solution come up, and obviously the graph, tooting our own horn, there's quite a few projects that have still chosen to not build on an open API. I think the most important thing is making sure developers are aware that they don't need to be building their own proprietary servers. And we see the graph actually as a way to accelerate learning into Web3, where if you're a JavaScript developer or Web2 developer, maybe by building or using an existing subgraph, you're able to learn about the protocol versus spending hours, decoding those contracts, building your own server, et cetera. And so really, if we can combine decentralized indexing, decentralized storage, I think we're most of the way there. Now, I'm sure the decentralization maximalists will also say decentralizing compute. So, there's a lot of hype around Urbit and others. I know Golem was around for a while, but in my opinion, it needs to be every layer.
Thank you.
Amazing, amazing. Cool. We'll go to Michael's question. Please go ahead, Michael.
Oh, hi, thanks. I was just, I don't use the graph protocol myself, and I know I can look it up, but I always like to ask folks who have substantial DAOs about kind of what the business model is and how people are making money or how the protocol makes money and how the different stakeholders make money. And is it at a state yet where people are like essentially supporting themselves from it, or is it a kind of a hybrid? I mean, I think most DAOs are a hybrid of economic participation and passion participation, but if you could just talk a little bit about the sort of the DAO as like an economic entity, that'd be great.
Yeah, so just to clarify, we haven't actually launched our DAO yet, but our network is live, and that network has hundreds of participants on, that are running indexing nodes, and thousands that are delegators. So just to address the business model question, for each stakeholder, that's a different answer. So in the graph network, we have GRT, which is a utility token that you need to stake in order to provide services. So similar to today, where you might pay AWS or any other kind of cloud or web provider, dApps will be paying essentially the graph indexers for their per query fees. The difference here between a Web2 business model is a dApp developer typically has to run that server, pay for the G Cloud, pay for all the services, et cetera. While here, maybe they just have an account and they're paying per query. And the reason we can do this is because the dApp developer then is only using the API. They're only querying the API. Maybe they're maintaining it. They're not maintaining any of the backend. And the backend is maintained by indexers. So indexers, receive protocol rewards, very similar to most other protocols. And they also receive these fees from dApps. So in full fruition, you can imagine, for example, the Uniswap team paying for the queries for their app to the indexers that are serving their queries at that time. Now, the way that the fees break down is delegators who delegate their GRT to indexers also make a cut of that fee. So a delegator might be someone like a retail investor that wants to participate but doesn't want to run an indexer. And then also curators are the folks that are signaling or staking on the subgraph itself. So the way that indexers know, hey, I need to prioritize the Uniswap subgraph is they take a look, they see, wow, this is one of the most curated subgraphs. Clearly our community understands this is valuable. We're going to make sure we prioritize it. So at the user experience level, it should be no different than interacting with any gateway, whether it's AWS or whatnot. At the back end, it's maybe millions of people eventually somehow getting paid. Right now it's thousands, but we're hoping to watch that grow. And over the last year since we launched, we've really been bootstrapping the network, and that economics and price discovery hasn't quite gotten to balance yet. But we've started helping teams migrate from the original hosted service to the network, so that we'll see more query volume. And we're also trying to help indexers just become more efficient at their operations. So long term, it makes it a lot easier for someone to be a member of the network rather than right now, it kind of still requires some in-depth knowledge.
Thank you.
Amazing. We'll keep it rolling with Tommy.
So I've never used the graph, but I've heard kind of some cool things about it. I'm trying to convert some traditional Apollo Federation servers into maybe the graph. And like, I didn't know this until you explained it, but I would basically have to run my own IPFS node to serve some of the content, or are we?
So you don't have to. That is just the common bad trend of many protocols. So I'd say the best decentralized solution would be to pin it to maybe IPFS and Arweave, or you can just pin directly to Arweave. It kind of depends. I've heard that the IPFS route has been interesting because it allows developers to have some control, and then they just pin that data to Arweave, so it's immutable. Whereas like otherwise, you're just kind of relying on your own running of the node. And then maybe the long-term solution is the graph indexing all CIDs and all metadata that's stored on Arweave. So we announced recently that we're working on an integration to be able to support Arweave. And what we found is one of the most common use cases of using Arweave is actually other chains archiving their data on Arweave. So for example, Solana, it's actually almost impossible to get a historical view at any point. And so what people are doing now is storing historical Solana state on Arweave and then querying directly from Arweave. So, IPFS is just one path, but, Arweave, IPFS, there's kind of a combination of protocols that could be interesting depending on your use case.
It's really nice to see all these nice dev tools built. It was so hard in 2017. I really believe in the mission.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're interested in working more closely with the GraphQL schema, apply for a grant. We're looking for teams to help, on anything, everything. And, even more recently, we're trying to dive in more on subgraph features to improve that DevX.
Sweet. I want to get to this freedom conversation with Mark, but I have a sense that it may take a few minutes, and we got to a question close to Amir's. So maybe we go to Amir first, and then we come back to freedom and that conversation. Amir, on incentive design, if you'd be willing, would be happy to have you ask.
Yeah, is my camera working? Yeah. So yeah, I looked through the graph stocks, and it took me quite a while to understand how all the different actors interact and how that creates a good system. And I just wanted to know who designed the incentive mechanism and like where you got the inspiration from, because I haven't really seen any other projects that combine so many different actors and then like they all actually work together.
Yeah, so the protocol itself was co-founded by three folks. So Yaniv Tal, who's currently CEO of Edge and Node, Brandon Ramirez is research lead, and Giannis Pullman is tech lead. And this really was years of research. So the graph has been around for over 2.5 years now. We originally ran a hosted service, so we recognized finding product market fit was more important with the subgraph prior to decentralizing. So we've been running a hosted service for over 2 years. That's what most DeFi projects use right now. But Brandon really was the research lead in designing the protocol, but also gained a lot of inspiration from other protocols. So we've been in the Ethereum space for a while. Andy, having been around since the token curated registry hype, one could say the graph is the largest token curated registry on mainnet because people are curating subgraphs. And so it's really a combination of research and just culminating into our use case. I would also say Block Science and a few of the other research organizations in Web3 were really helpful in modeling out economics. So if you are trying to build out a complex system, I know they've worked with teams like ours, the Graph, they've worked with Reflexer, anything that might require, maybe an algorithm or some kind of programmatic function for rewards, as we had, good idea to reach out to them. One last thing is we included something called a Cobbs-Douglas function, which actually came from the 0x protocol. So another, great shout out of building on others. And the goal of that function is to reward folks commensurate to the contributions they actually provide. So if you're an indexer and you're just running the indexing node, you should not be earning as much as someone who's an indexer and also serving queries. And so that's an example of a parameter that's, there to enable greater participation. But even still, we've received feedback that split isn't enough. And so some indexers are saying there's people who are working harder and we need to change that ratio. So the design continues even today with GIP's graph improvement proposals to adjust parameters.
Cool, thank you.
Incredible. Okay, Eva, we've been peppering you. There's more. How does like about 10 more minutes for Q&A sound? Is that cool?
Awesome.
Awesome. Okay. So Mark with freedom, which seems to be kind of like a broad discussion. Mark, why don't you take it away?
I'll make it more concise. So hey Eva, great stuff that you're in the graph. We were doing something and something I just as a side note, hope the graph thinks about in the future is even decentralizing the database itself that it's using, which is something that we were doing in the past. We were building a query layer previously, but I think, yeah, if the graph is somehow tackles the database, which I know is not a fun thing to tackle because no one wants to roll their own database. I think that would make the graph like super like the most powerful query engine in the market, right? Anyway, that's a side thing. Main things about freedom, and I think this is really important because I think, all of us love freedom. Like how can you talk about freedom and have someone that's like, oh, no, we don't want more freedom. Like everyone wants more freedom, but the problem in the big picture and we'll say this from like a sort of subversion, geopolitical, like a military perspective, is that societies that are authoritarian love when we want more freedom because that gives them more freedom to meddle in our democracy and to whether it's cyber attacks in a more meat space term in terms of like all these bots they have on social media that they create the illusion of conversation and the illusion of agreements of ideas and of concepts and of events that are happening that's based on like disinformation. It gives them more freedom to spread disinformation, which is a problem when we talk about like, hey, we want more freedom. And it's like altruistic. It's like amazing. I want more freedom too. But then it comes with these other things that we haven't really solved. Is that that also gives our bad actors more freedom to then spread bad things. So I wonder, I don't know if this is something that the graph has thought about. I guess maybe this ties into like identity and reputation systems, but more so how can we follow through on this path of having more freedom while also being cognizant of how more freedom can be abused and how we can best design a system such that we can prevent the worst from happening with being given, like you mentioned Parler as an example. And Parler is also a great example in terms of a social network that is being used as a disinformation engine, right? So it's like, it's this weird nuance, like gray area of we don't want to be censoring people, but at the same time, those that, not in all cases, but in some cases, some that are being censored, it is, one can argue it is for the greater good of people being able to get good consensus on truth, what's trusted information, versus like people building up these companies that can get censored, but it's like they're like 51% attacking the consensus of what is factual information in our society for us to all come to a consensus together on like, accurate information, right? And I think that's a much harder conversation to talk about, but I wanted to open it up and see what your take is there, because I think that is like the elephant in the room when it comes to freedom. And on both sides of the aisle, like I'm not a fan of censorship because it can be used poorly, but then censorship in very nuanced cases is actually very important for us to be able to have good conversation with each other. So it's this sort of weird paradox, right? And I don't know if that's something that you've thought of a lot and if you have a take there.
Yeah, really appreciate the question. I'm gonna also think about this some more. I like my immediate reaction is like when we talk about freedom, what that means to me is access. What we don't have right now in Web 2 is unlimited access. So the idea of like unbank the banks, the purpose of that was like, there are people who currently aren't banked, even though they want to be. Now, the idea of like what happens when there's too much freedom, right? So let's say everyone has access to a protocol, everyone has access to an Ethereum wallet. To me, then it becomes much more about curation of quality. And that's where, mechanisms like token curated registries or any kind of signaling or staking comes into play, because you can actually put your money where your mouth is. Or it's, a decision driven by consensus, kind of like you pointed out. So, one example could be, let's say Parler one day, is actually spreading information, good information, it's just controversial. And so maybe indexers choose to serve the queries that day. But maybe the next day, it's disinformation and, people don't like it. And maybe all indexers decide to boycott. And that's like a decision of social consensus. That's not necessarily an authoritarian decision of censorship. That is like maybe hundreds of thousands of people who have all agreed we don't want to be supporting this. So I think that crypto actually kind of like supports this dichotomy of freedom, enabling access, but also now developing the abilities of like maintaining quality. So even going back to the let's embrace the Sybil attacker, if we raise our standards of quality or what it means to even get attention in crypto, that would likely reduce the poor signal. The other cool thing about crypto from an economic perspective is everything is about the opportunity cost of capital, right? So like, whereas before maybe we were staking our attention or it was just us downloading an app on our phone, now it's literally us staking capital. And the switching cost of that capital is very, very low. It's very easy for you to unstake at any time or transfer or exchange. And so that means there's no loyalty. And we can actually participate in anything. And the decision to then stake or curate is actually quite significant. And so perhaps we can create even higher quality filters now with that incentive baked in than we could before.
Very cool. You brought up a lot of great points. Those are all awesome. Yeah, I think, yeah, the one thing is then like the indexers knowing what's disinformation, and it's so effective because most often the people that are consuming it don't know that it is, right? And so that's what makes it so damn hard. So like the more people, and I talk to people about this all the time, and it's like the more people we can have thinking about this, it's so important because like it gets in the way of us being able to have like a well-functioning democracy or whatever we evolve DAOs to be, right? Maybe something that goes beyond democracy, something even better, right? I don't know, but thanks for a great answer. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Some good stuff in the chat as well. Thank you for asking, Mark. We'll keep it rolling. I think Matthew, well, let me see. Maybe Matthew and then Tim, we can end with you for the last two questions.
Hey, Eva. I'm curious, I guess, your point you were making about how the graph manages like a very diverse group of interests and stakeholders, whereas a lot of protocols at the moment kind of are aligned around one thing. And I guess I was just curious, you were talking about like the structure of the council and how you're kind of trying to manage that and bring everyone's viewpoints in. I'm just curious, as the graph has kind of matured and you look back on it now, like, if you were starting today, would you do that structure in a different way, or is there things that you've changed? Because as we kind of progress more and more down building things for wider societal use, there's going to be broader kind of different groups coming in. So I'm just curious what you've learned from the process or kind of would, advise people to think about.
Yeah, great point. So I would say it was a good decision to start. It's definitely achieved our goals that we didn't want to decentralize too quickly while we were still building out some of the infrastructure. And that was kind of the impetus. One thing I might change is, bringing in domain experts sooner. So a lot of what we've realized is like, yes, the council's quite intelligent, but had we maybe had a specific expert that was more tied to that proposal, maybe we could have gotten that proposal across sooner. And so, we're organically realizing why a more decentralized DAO needs to exist is because 10 people or even 20 people might not be the ones that have all the answers. And we actually do need these other layers of expertise. And, typically it's called consulting in Web2 world or contracting. And here, us trying to figure out how do we then scale, the council while keeping the council structure as is at the moment by getting more input. So for example, we do use Snapshot for community sentiment, and we're now trying to lean in even more on our forum. Even the foundation, a lot of our grants, we're now trying to bring in domain experts much sooner. So that way we get all that kind of off-chain information without on-chain committing to a new decentralized structure. But the goal always was to fully decentralize. So even in our announcement post, we discussed maybe it's nested DAOs. So maybe it's still that we represent these 5 stakeholder groups, but instead of 2 individuals, it's maybe a DAO and a beneficiary address, and maybe there's 10 people in that cohort. And so maybe there's now 10 people that make decisions or are the domain experts around indexing, and then their decisions bubble up to the council or to some other larger DAO. So I think it's been pretty good so far because it's allowed us to learn. It's also pointed out just the need for decentralizing quickly.
Amazing. Cool. Okay, I think we got one more from Tim. Maybe.
Oh, hey, I thought I saw my question repeated up the way and I didn't know I was going to be asked to ask it on voice, but I can anyway. I just wanted you to go into more about, I really love the conversation and also in the chat about real names, anonymity, freedom, responsibility. And I've never really been able to reconcile anonymity and pseudonymity with like its potential to be abused, and its potential to do harm. I'm very much in favor of this sort of like open web, ethos of like free expression and data ownership and immutability. But that's just the thing that I've not been able to, like, how does this solve that? Especially if we look at the last, let's just say 10 years of the internet and how and the consequences of Web 2.
Yeah, I guess the first thing is, I don't know if anonymity really exists. I think it's kind of a meme, really. It's pseudonymity, because usually there's at least one person who knows that person's real identity or, some other fact. And in that lens, like, reputation still matters, right? Like the reason people become anon or, attribute a different identity isn't because they don't want to necessarily be identified at all. It's that they want to compartmentalize their identity or maybe create a separate brand. And so I think the biggest misconception, at least with like eGirl Capital and other anons in crypto, is that these are scammers or they're, anon because they want to be a bad actor, when really like they've developed a reputation for years. Like someone like Loomdart, he's literally been a crypto OG since like 2011. And so it's actually quite high of a cost for him to try and be malicious. And so, there are ways that we can have anonymity or pseudonymity in a way that still keep the people accountable. Because the goal is not, for us to not have work or not have friends, it's to just choose the way we do that. One of the more exciting or positive outcomes, I think, of this trend is VTubing. So I don't know if anyone's seen that here. There's actually a really great technician. Her name is Miko. And so she actually makes these like anime avatars of herself. She wears this, I don't know what it's called, but it's like one of those body sensors. And essentially on video, she is this character. And, you wouldn't know that it was her, what she looked like. She, could be, a penguin for all we know. But it allows her to then create this persona and identity, maybe even job that's different than before. So I almost like want to challenge our community to think about like, what are the other positive impacts of Sybil attacking? Like, if you ever wanted to do a job that you were concerned wouldn't be accepted by your current boss or your current community, imagine if you could have now multiple jobs. You could have Eva 1, who's an indexer, and Eva 2, who's like a degen on, Yield Farmer. And these are separate addresses, separate identities, separate like revenue streams, but they're all me, and I get to identify as them. And I think that, that could open up an opportunity for us, even as people, to be much more collaborative with our skills rather than like boxing ourselves into one job for 20 years.
Eva, I don't know if those two identities were just kind of randomly made up or just kind of like off the cuff. Interesting. Cool. Okay.
This feels like a perfect moment to just acknowledge the meme being retweeted by Elon as we're speaking about degens. So what was that like for you? Like, what have the last 24 hours been like for you on Twitter?
I mean, so I make memes all the time. So to me, this feels like I finally won the meme prize. Like I've been like, finally gotten the attention of the meme lord. It would have been fun, I guess, to be mentioned, but I think the beauty is like memes are permissionless and they're like composable. And this is just another example of like, no one owns memes. What I've been thinking about since then is like, how do NFTs actually solve this problem? Because like, I'm not an artist full time, but had I been, I probably would be even more mad. And so like, what mechanisms exist, in the NFT space that we should maybe be employing in mimetic culture, given how, composable NFTs are now becoming, where like you can have a subgraph, for example, of CryptoPunks, and maybe you build a metaverse out of many subgraphs. So your hashmap and your CryptoPunk can like fight each other. And so, that's what memes are. Memes are you sticking this Pepe on this other image and then, screenshotting it or whatever it is and, deploying it. And most of the best memes are built on other memes. So maybe there's a future here where meme composability actually gets to incentivize the meme creators.
Alicia, wait until you find out that Eva is Elon.
For my next trick.
Amazing. Okay. I have one other thing that I just like want to share. It's something that like really kind of like resonates with me for this module. This module, we've had 4 guests over the 4 kernel blocks. We had Juan Benet from Filecoin. We had second David Vorik and Mansi Vora from Saya. And then in the third block, we had Sam Williams from Arweave, and now we've had Eva from the Graph. And with the collection of these four projects, I've had a scaffolding for what I think is my favorite brief in all of the kernel syllabus, which is this remember brief. And Andy refers to it at the beginning. So we've already talked about the three main pillars of Take Back the Web. Augmenting our ability to think for ourselves. I think we've had great conversation about that, reclaiming our time and extending our ability to cooperate. I just want to call out that this brief combines two essays, if you haven't read it yet, one from Vannevar Bush, who was the director of the Office of Scientific Research right after World War II, who was trying to answer the question, how can we continue to cooperate in ways that we were able to successfully do during World War II after the war is over? That was his job. That was what he was supposed to do. And he has a couple of quotes that really stand out to me. The inheritance from the master becomes not only his additions to the world record, but for his disciples, the entire scaffolding by which they were erected. So this is kind of like something that I think about when I think about this new world record that's being created that is ownerless and owned by no one. But where the graph really comes in for me that I'm still like grappling with and trying to understand what it means is a little later, where it says a record, if it is to be useful to science, must be continuously extended, it must be stored, and above all, it must be consulted. The specific times and places in which it is consulted and the means by which consultation occurs has traditionally been a few options are provided to us in Web 2 world. And with something like the graph, it feels like the Cambrian explosion is now possible. And so that consultation step is the piece that really has me excited. Vannevar Bush wrote about this in 1945, and we've been on a long journey towards this point, and I'm sure it'll continue after us. But I just want to thank Eva for being here and joining a long tradition of wonderful guests during this particular fireside. It's been great to have you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say I was part of On Deck, and this is a really amazing group. Kernel, I think, could be better.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Cool, cool. Andy, Alicia, anything else that you guys have before we switch over to GatherTown?
Thank you very much, Elon. It's been such a pleasure having you, truly.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so the GatherTown link for those who want to hang out after, I'm going to put in the chat to this. That didn't work. Hold on. We're going to try a new GatherTown. There's a GatherTown with pods and tables, so feel free to pop into that link. If you've seen your pods, you might be able to find them at the tables. I'm sure it'll be a random smattering of people who join, so don't stress about finding your pods members too quickly. But thank you so much for being with us for another fireside. It's a joy, and really appreciated the Q&A. It was wonderful. So thank you everyone who asked questions. Okay, bye-bye all.
Thank you. Yay.
Give thanks and praise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Who's the baby? Okay. Yes. Ooh, no ID. Let me see about that. I mean, how about now? No? I see some people in here. Just wait.